Hello, my name is Luis Loria and I am president of Ideas Labs. We feel very honored for being selected as a finalist for the prestigious Templeton Freedom Award for our efforts to put an end to legalized plunder in the form of luxury pension schemes that benefit Ticos con Corona, or Costa Ricans with crowns as we call them. Former presidents of the Republic, congressmen, Supreme Court judges, and well-respected academics and opinion leaders, among others, live as societal leeches and suck yearly more than 2% of the country's GDP or 10% of central government spending. Ideas Labs is also working to eliminate regulatory barriers that make it difficult, costly, or impossible to work through our Freedom to Work project, which also emphasizes the important links between work and human dignity, and work as a means to improve one's prosperity and the prosperity of others. We would like to thank Atlas Network's donors for their support and the Templeton Religion Trust for this recognition that will allow us to scale up our efforts to fight for freedom.
My name is Niels Veldhuis, and I'm the president of the Fraser Institute, Canada's leading think tank and a proud member of the Atlas Network. Given all the wonderful work that's done around the world by network members, we are humbled and honored to be recognized as a finalist for this year's Templeton Freedom Award. Our Alberta Prosperity Initiative was launched to re-establish Alberta to its traditional place as the most economically free jurisdiction in North America, after successive governments, both on the left and on the right, had greatly damaged the province. We did so through solid research and a broad-based education campaign. In 2018 and 2019, we released 25 major research papers and 200 commentaries on Alberta policy. We generated massive amounts of media, generating 1,400 media mentions in the 2-year period, and reached 1.5 million Albertans, almost 40% of the population, through social media. In 2019, prior to the election, we published a book summarizing all of our recommendations and sent it to every politician in the province. After the election, the new government put in place measures to achieve all 9 of our major recommendations, and the Premier himself noted the Fraser Institute's Alberta Prosperity Initiative for generating the facts and the arguments to win public support for these changes. As always, this was a major team effort, and I want to thank all of my colleagues at the Fraser Institute, our wonderful supporters, and our board of directors. But most importantly, I want to thank the Atlas Network for everything you do to support freedom around the world.
This is some top-notch content, and I hope you're enjoying Liberty Forum and Freedom Dinner Online as much as I am. Don't forget that you could be joining us in person next year at one of our events, and there's so many fantastic opportunities for you to enjoy. But don't just take my word for it, let's hear from some of our partners.
Hi, this is Anthea Haryati from the Center for Indonesian Policy Studies. I am the head of external relations. I would say my most favorable moment from the Atlas Network, Liberty Forum, and Freedom Dinners was the opportunity to compete in the Think Tank Shark Tank competition in 2016. Every time I attend these Liberty Forums and dinners, whether it's the regional ones or the ones in New York, it's such an incredible atmosphere where you just leave inspired and grateful to be able to work with so many other people who are promoting freedom around the world.
The Constitution protects us from an overreaching government.
It's the set of rules that our country ideally adheres to.
It's a collective we.
For more than 2 centuries, Americans have fought to establish liberty, expand liberty, and preserve liberty.
Government has to explain itself to individuals, not the other way around. That's the presumption of liberty.
I'm Doug Ginsberg, and I'm a federal judge. As Americans, we have a strong belief that no government should be able to tell us what we must say or must not say.
That idea has always been under siege, and always will be.
The original sin of the Constitution was its treatment of African Americans and its preservation of slavery.
Yes, they said all men are created equal, but they didn't mean it.
Americans are funny people. They tend to take their liberties for granted until they see them being threatened, and then they pounce.
This is the First Amendment that protects your right to stand here, protects mine.
We did not have money. We did not have power. We were pariahs, but the First Amendment gave us our voices. And that's what made all the difference.
The presumption is that whatever the government's doing to you is legitimate, and the government doesn't even need to explain it. Boy, do I disagree with that.
Well, Dr. Franklin, what have you given us?
Well, sir, a republic, if you can keep it.
Most people don't know what their rights are.
I'm busy doing laundry and carpooling and getting the dog to the vet. I don't have the first clue where to go to protect my constitutional rights. That slippery slope just starts, and all of a sudden, it's gone, and you don't realize that that's what's happening.
Join me, Doug Ginsberg, on a personal journey as I explore our more or less perfect union and our struggle for liberty.
Hi, I'm Robert Enlow, President and CEO of EdChoice. 25 years ago, Milton Friedman started the Milton and Rose Friedman Foundation. And we at EdChoice have proudly taken up that mantle and continued to work on the issue of EdChoice, school choice, parental freedom, as Milton Friedman wants us to, and has always asked us to when he was alive, and even challenged us to now that he's gone. We've been happy to do so with our partners at the Atlas Network. For years, we have appreciated all the joint work, joint conferences, joint efforts to advance liberty in education and liberty for all human beings. It's been a great pleasure and honor to be associated with Atlas Network over the years, and we at EdChoice look forward to the next 25 years. As we look towards the future of education and educational liberty, we know that Atlas will be there with us every step of the way, because both of us are committed to keeping Milton Friedman's ideals well and alive.
Just be careful, nah. Love ain't simple, nah. Promise me no promises. Oh, nah. Just be careful, nah. Love ain't simple, nah. Promise me no promises. In the water, but baby, we can't see the bottom. I just wanna dive in with you. I just wanna lie here with you. Oh, no, just be careful, no. Love ain't simple, no. Promise me no promises. Oh, no, just be careful, no. Love ain't simple, no. Promise me no promises. Promise me no promises. Don't you promise me nothing. Just be careful. Promise me no promises.
Falling too fast to prepare for this. Tripping in the world could be dangerous. Everybody circling as vultures. Negative, nepotist. Everybody waiting for the fall of man. Everybody praying for the end of times. Everybody hoping they could be the one. I was born to run, I was born for this. Whip, run me like a racehorse. Pull me like a ripcord. Break me down and build me up. I wanna be the slip. Word upon your lip. Rather that you rip. Break me down and build me up. Whatever it takes. visual. I wanna be invisible. Looking at my years like a martyrdom. Everybody needs to be a part of them. Never be enough from the prodigal son. I was born to run, I was born for this. Whip, whip, run me like a racehorse. Pull me like a ripcord. Break me down and build me up. I wanna be the slip, slip. Word upon your lip, lip. Rather that you rip, rip. Break me down and build me up. Whatever it takes. 'Cause I love the adrenaline in my veins. I do whatever it takes. 'Cause I love how it feels when I break the chains. Whatever it takes. Yeah, take me to the top. I'm ready for whatever it takes. 'Cause I love the adrenaline in my veins. I do what it takes, but critical, egotistical. Don't wanna be the parenthetical, hypothetical. Working out of something that I'm proud of. Out of the box, an epoxy to the world and the vision we've lost. I'm an apostrophe. I'm just a symbol to remind you that there's more to see. I'm just a product of the system of catastrophe, and yet a masterpiece, and yet I'm half diseased. And when I am deceased, at least I go down to the grave and die happily, and leave the body of my soul to be a part of it. I do what it takes, whatever it takes. 'Cause I love the adrenaline in my veins. I do whatever it takes. 'Cause I love how it feels when I break the chains. Whatever it takes. Yeah, take me to the top. I'm ready for whatever it takes. 'Cause I love the adrenaline in my veins. I do what it takes.
On a Saturday night in the summer, sundown and they all come out. Lamborghinis and they rented hummus. The party's on, so they're heading downtown. Everybody's looking for a come up, and they wanna know what you're about. Me in the middle with the one I loving. We're just trying to figure everything out. We don't fit in well, 'cause we are just ourselves. I could use some help getting out of this conversation. Yeah, you look stunning, dear, so don't ask that question here. This is my only fear, that we become beautiful people. Top designer clothes, front row fashion shows. What you do and who'd you know? Inside the world of beautiful people. Champagne and rolled up nose, prenups and broken homes. Surrounded but still alone. Let's leave the party. That's not who we are. We are not beautiful. Yeah, that's not who we are. We are not beautiful. True for hours last night and we made it nowhere. Now I see stars in your eyes when we're halfway there. Oh, now I'm not fazed by all the lights and flashy cameras. 'Cause with my arms around you, there's no need to care. We don't fit in well, we are just ourselves. I could use some help getting out of this conversation here. You look stunning, please, so don't ask that question here. This is my only fear, that we become beautiful people. Top designer clothes, front row fashion shows. What you do and who'd you know? Inside the world of beautiful people. Champagne and rolled up nose, prenups and broken homes. Surrounded but still.
Welcome, everyone. This is the last session of the 2020 Liberty Forum, but I do expect to see all of you in less than 6 hours. That is when our Freedom Dinner grand finale begins at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I know for our friends in Africa and Europe, we're asking you to stay up late tonight, but it's going to be worth it. So I hope you're looking forward to that. And our friends in Asia, I hope you set your alarms early so you can get a few hours of sleep. But you're going to want to be attentive during this last session because in this final session of Liberty Forum, we are releasing research findings that will be published more formally by Atlas Network in coming months. And in this session, I'll be joined by Professor Carlos Newland from Argentina and Pál Czeglédi from Hungary. The three of us have prepared a 10-minute video to present the study and its findings. I'd like for you to share your questions in the chat area of this session so we can have a lively discussion period following the presentation in the second half of this session. But first, the video presenting our findings.
Greetings. I'm Brad Lips. I'm the CEO of Atlas Network, and I'm excited to tell you today about a project called the Global Index of Economic Mentality, which builds on previous scholarship that was done by my co-authors, Carlos Newland, professor at ESEADE University in Argentina, and Pál Czeglédi from the University of Debrecen in Hungary. I'll begin by explaining why I was excited to join this research project. And that's because there's growing empirical evidence that many positive social indicators are highly associated with economic freedom. When economic freedom ticks up as measured by the Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom of the World report or the World Bank's Doing Business Index, poverty rates tend to tick down. But what enables economic freedom to increase in the first place? Our hypothesis is that it likely has to do with achieving a level of consensus within the broader population about the desirability of the institutions that we associate with economic freedom. This is the direction that Nobel laureate Douglas North was taking in his later years, looking at whether common cultural heritages affected economic performance. The great scholar of business strategy, Michael Porter, has followed this same path, and the idea is central to Deirdre McCluskey's trilogy on the bourgeois era. She makes the case that the great enrichment that began to take off in the 18th century, that it would have been impossible in the absence of an ideological change that made engaging in enterprise socially respectable. In the think tank community that my organization, Atlas Network, is immersed in, we often talk about the Overton window, the idea that only a range of public policies will appear to be politically acceptable to the mainstream population at a given time. For Atlas Network and the think tanks that share our vision, our raison d'etre is to shift the Overton window so there will be more economic freedom, allowing more people to prosper. Now, researchers often use polling data to measure movement in the Overton window as it relates to specific areas of policy reform. But how might we measure the Overton window in general to know whether we're succeeding or failing in persuading the public about the merits of economic freedom? Well, enter the Global Index of Economic Mentality. This is a cross-country study measuring popular support for economic freedom. The countries that score high are skeptical about government playing a major role in directing economic activity or in redistributing wealth. In countries at the top of our rankings, people largely believe that economic outcomes are determined by their own individual effort. It's perhaps not surprising that there does appear to be a strong association between economic mentality as measured in our index and economic freedom as measured by the Fraser Index and per capita GDP, which is almost twice as high for the countries in the top 2 quartiles in our survey compared to countries in the bottom quartile.
I would like to explain how we calculated the Global Index of Economic Mentality. The calculation has 3 steps. The first is to process the data from the World Values Survey European Values Study database, a combined database. In this database, one can find observations on individual respondents from 77 countries, with about 1,500 respondents from each country. At the start, therefore, we have about 120,000 observations. In the first step, we calculated the country averages. For those 6 questions, we decided our index should include. These questions are: if private ownership should increase, if competition is good, if a democracy should tax the rich and subsidize the poor, and make incomes more equal, if income equality are more important than the incentives of inequality, and finally, if the government or the individual should take more responsibility. Among the answers, there are don't know answers, which we took as missing. The second step of this calculation process is the normalization. So we normalize the data to make the values of the 6 questions more comparable than when they are measured with the original scale. So the normalization means to transform the scale into an interval running roughly between 0 and 1 by choosing a minimum and a maximum. This is done for each question separately. The country averages are first ranked, then the highest and the lowest value are picked and set to 1 and 0. But they are not used to calculate the maximum and the minimum for the normalization to avoid the biasing effect of the outliers. So the maximum values are calculated as the average of the second, third, and fourth highest values, and the minimum is calculated as the average of the second, third, and fourth lowest values. So in this way, we get some variables running between 0 and 1. And the third step of the calculation process is to aggregate the variables, which is done by taking simple averages. To do this, we group the questions into 3 variables, which we call efficiency, distribution, and responsibility. The variable efficiency is the average of the questions as to what extent private ownership is desirable, and secondly, how good competition is. The variable distribution is the average of the question as to, first, what extent it is desirable in a democracy to tax the rich, and secondly, to equalize incomes. And finally, the third variable, called responsibility, is the average of the question concerned with, first, the trade-off between income equality and incentives, and secondly, the one concerned with how much responsibility the individuals should take as opposed to how much the government should take. And finally, the average of these 3 variables give the global index of economic mentality.
GM, the index that measures economic mentality, gives us a way to compare mindsets along different nations. As you can see on the map, there seems to be a diagonal avenue that crosses the globe, a diagonal which covers less market-friendly countries that are all marked in red. On the left and on the right of the diagonal, we find sets of nations that seem to appreciate competitive private markets and limited government intervention. Which are the top scoring countries in our index, or the champions as we call them? First comes New Zealand, followed by the Czech Republic, Sweden, the United States, and Denmark. All these nations present high income per capita and good economic institutions that allow the development of a productive economy. We have in our index 74 political units that show great variations in the appreciation of capitalism. Due to the time limit, we will now describe the values attained by different countries or conglomerates, following the groupings used by the Atlas network. We'll find the highest GM scores in the United States and in Australia and New Zealand, while the lowest appear in Central and South Asia. We first take a look at the United States, one of the GM champions, a country which scores high on the efficiency and non-redistribution variables, but gets a lower mark in the appreciation of personal responsibility. Given its importance in the global economy, the high values attained by the US have a global impact, not only because of trade effects, but also due to its cultural relevance. Oceania ranks high in the ranking in its 2 members. New Zealand is one of the champions, and Australia is in the 9th place. Europe as a whole is somewhat in the middle of the table, although its mentality is diverse. Northern Europe shows high values, with 2 GM champions, Denmark and Sweden. We also find high values in some nations of Eastern Europe, with the Czech Republic as one of the champions. On the other hand, Southern Europe tends to present much lower scores. Latin America is located in the middle of the ranking. Colombia and Guatemala show the best regional scores. On the other hand, and perhaps not surprising given the recent political and social turmoil, we find Chile with the lowest value. East Asia and the Pacific have countries that show relatively good GM scores, like Taiwan, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Hong Kong. Interesting is that nor Japan nor South Korea have very high GM values. China presents middle lower scores, especially due to its appreciation of income redistribution. Sub-Saharan Africa, a continent with scarce data, shows middle to low values, the same as West Asia and North Africa. Outliers due to higher scores of this big conglomerate are Georgia and Armenia. Finally, Central and South Asia also is located in a low place in the ranking. Using a more restrictive index, we can follow the evolution of pro-market mentality in the last decade. At a global level, the index does not present big changes over time. However, if we divide the countries between the richer and poorer half, we find that the index is increasing for the affluent and decreasing for the poor. This is not good news if we value global convergence, since this situation may create a greater difference in institutions and economic performance between the rich and the poor. Finally, we look at the economic mentality dividing those individuals surveyed over and under 40 years of age. At a global level, there are not big differences between generations. One big exception is the United States, where the younger generation is significantly less supportive of free markets than the older generation. On the other hand, the opposite happens in many ex-communist European countries. If we only used the young to construct the index, most GM champions would belong to Eastern Europe, and they would be first the Czech Republic, followed by Romania, Estonia, Georgia, and Poland.
Okay, now that last slide that we showed in the video shows the full rankings for all the countries for which we had data. I imagine some of you wanted to press pause so you could see where your country ranks. Right now, we have posted a copy of the slides as a PDF. It's embedded within a news story. So if you go to atlasnetwork.org right now, click on the News and Analysis tab at the top, that'll be the top story. So you can then take a look at the full slides. I know that my co-authors, who I'm going to bring up on the screen right now, would be very excited for your feedback. So let's bring up Carlos Newland, Pál Czeglédi. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Now, the plan for us is to respond to some questions from our audience that are coming in through the chat box. So I'll encourage our audience to continue to participate there. But I know that the three of us had some questions on our own, and I thought that it would be fun to call on some of the experts that are watching right now to get their insights. And Carlos, I know you had a question about New Zealand, and our dear friend David Seymour he's woken up in the middle of the night to be part of this. So we're really grateful for that, David. He's a veteran of many Atlas programs from his think tanker days. In recent years, he's been a member of parliament in New Zealand and leads that country's ACT New Zealand party. So Carlos, can we have you pose a question to David?
Yes. Hi, David. First, congratulations. If an Oscar existed for good economic mentality, you'd be taking it to your country. You know, New Zealand has been compared many times with Argentina and Australia, and we were all rich countries in the 1900s, and now we are Argentina is a poor country, and you are wealthy. And I think it's caused by our mentality and institutions compared to your mentality and institutions. Now, when the result of New Zealand appeared as the champion, the world champion of economic mentality, and this is consistent with other measures we've done for other years, so it's pretty stable result. I didn't know much about New Zealand, so I went to look at its government, and I had a great surprise. I was expecting somebody like Margaret Thatcher to be the prime minister, or at least her economic views. But I found that your prime minister is Jacinta Ardern. So that surprised me a lot. And maybe she was I think, the head of a socialist young organization, and her views perhaps would be more natural to expect to be in Argentina than in New Zealand. So I would like your comments about that.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's lovely to see you, Brad. You know, my image of people is how they looked when I first met them. And you haven't changed in 12, 15 years, completely preserved. So it's fantastic. And I hope that you're well over there and getting through this tumultuous year of 2020. Look, I guess there's a paradox if you take political optics and marketing at face value. Yes, New Zealand has just had a landslide victory to a party that is rhetorically, at least, of the left. But I think actually, if you look a little bit closer, what you'll find is more validation of your thesis that there is an underlying culture that makes some countries more likely to choose free market policies. And a better way to think about it would be to say, have a look at the New Zealand Labour Party and see what a left-wing party looks like in this New Zealand context. So Jacinda Ardern is committed to broad-based low-rate taxes. We have no basic personal exemption. They're not even talking about introducing one, and that's fantastic. There has been discussion 4 times in New Zealand history about introducing a capital gains tax. The most recent was during Jacinda Ardern's campaigning over the last year or so leading up to this election. The result of that discussion is she has ruled out introducing a capital gains tax for the entirety of her career. That puts New Zealand with, I think, one other country in the OECD that has no capital gains tax. We are culturally entirely committed to free trade. We have no subsidies for agriculture. And I could go on, but I won't. I hope you can see the point. Jacinda Ardern, in terms of the actual policy prescription that she advocates for and sustains, is a far better adherent of the free market than Donald Trump ever was or will be. And I suspect that ultimately this strengthens your thesis that we are a free market country. Now, the other question you might ask is, why might that be? I'll give you a couple of possible theories, which you may know more about than I do, having analyzed this stuff empirically rather than just theorized, because I'm a politician these days. And one is that, if you look at a map of New Zealand, we are children of pioneers. To be a New Zealander, we're incredibly diverse. We've got high schools where kids speak 60 languages. We've got every religion. We've got every creed. It's a very diverse place. But the one thing all of us have in common is that we've traveled further than any other humans for a better tomorrow. And, that is perhaps the most entrepreneurial thing you can do in terms of risking capital to better your options, is actually to move to a faraway, unknown land. And that's the one thing that all New Zealanders have done at some point in their history. In my case, my Indigenous ancestors 1,000 years ago, and my more British ancestors 100 years ago. The other thing that those British ancestors brought was a Protestant, common law tradition, which we've been really lucky, I think, to inherit. So that's affected our culture as well. And then there's just the simple fact that, on a frontier, you don't have to be here. In order to stay here, you have to be willing to keep making a living on the frontier of the world. First to see the light each day up against the international date line, but without some of the economies of scale and other sort of structural features that perhaps make it easier for some of those bigger government institutions to take hold. Now, I should say we've got all sorts of policy problems, and I lead a party which is 10 out of 120 in the legislature, which argues vociferously and continuously for free markets, free minds, and freedom over our bodies. We're probably the most and only libertarian party in the democratic world. So there's still lots to argue about. But if you look at the overall picture, I think what you've got is a nation of, Protestant immigrants with a common law framework, with a tradition of British liberty. And as a result of that, even if we get a prime minister who's rhetorically socialist, she can't introduce a capital gains tax.
Well, hey, David, thank you very much for taking the early wake-up call and for contributing those insights. We're now going to bring online Radko Nikolic, who runs the Center for Anti-Authoritarian Studies in Serbia, already a finalist for our Lights, Camera, Liberty contest earlier today. Pál, you are there in Hungary, and I know that the results of the index in Eastern Europe are some of the more intriguing. I think you had a question for Radko.
Yes, thank you. So, as someone from Eastern Europe, the most interesting result of a study was that the younger people in Eastern Europe are much more pro-market than the average. And if you just make a GM for the younger people, then all the countries at the top of the list are from Eastern Europe, like Czechia. So, and I know that Radko has a youth-oriented think tank in Serbia, here in Eastern European region. So I would be interested to hear his thoughts on this result.
Hello, everyone, and Pál, thank you very much for your question. So to answer your question, I think that the openness to socialist ideas and their utopian views of economic policy are pretty directly correlated with the lack of real-life experience of what they mean once they're implemented. Now, the idea of everyone being absolutely equal and working as much as they want while consuming all they want, well, we can all agree that is a very seductive idea. I mean, who wouldn't want that? And apparently from the findings that you've just presented, well, primarily those who know what it really looks in practice. The countries that you've mentioned spent a large chunk of the 20th century actually living that socialist dream that we often hear about. And in their direct experience, it turned to be more like a full-blown totalitarian nightmare against which they often rebelled, and only to be crushed by the Soviet army. And this is a very important part. In many of the Eastern European countries, socialism was implemented basically directly to foreign military occupation. It was never really sort of an authentic idea to begin with. Then I believe that being forced to embrace an obviously defunct economic system while witnessing the prosperity and individual liberty that went on the other side of the Iron Curtain really made people from this country value free markets and liberty a lot more than anyone who's sort of born into them and therefore takes them for granted. So I sincerely hope that people in the rest of the world, and particularly young people that we are talking about, will not have to directly experience the famine, the widespread corruption, and unchecked political tyranny before they learn the value of free markets and individual liberty. That is the duty of our movement. And I'm very glad to hear about all these wonderful stories of successes of Atlas Network's partners all around the world for the past 2 days, which make me very, very optimistic. So thank you guys, and keep it up.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Radko. I would like to stay on this topic of young people for a moment, because another finding that shows up in the data is a little bit worrisome for those of us who reside in the United States. And that is that while the U.S. has a pretty high score overall in the index relative to the rest of the world, there's no country that has as large a divergence between the opinions of the older generation, defined here as 40 and older, and the youth generation, 40 and younger, the latter being far more skeptical about economic freedom. So let's bring online Emily Chamble, the president of Institute for Humane Studies, which in my mind is the premier organization for cultivating classical liberalism within the academy here in the U.S. Something seems very wrong, Emily. So what are we going to do about it to get more young people appreciating economic liberty?
Thanks, Brad. It's great to be here. And I just want to say thank you to you and to the Atlas Network for making this possible, for all the ways in which you guys are always innovative under the current circumstances. It's particularly important to bring us all together. So I want to thank you for that. And from our conversations that we've had about this, Brad, I've have come to understand what the survey is really getting at is that the under 40 cohort is seeing government as the answer to the problems of the poor, and that's by intervening in the marketplace to bring about a kind of redistributive solution. And they also see markets, in particular private ownership and competition, as harmful. So if I'm understanding that correctly, I think that then clearly betrays a lack of economic understanding about how incentives work and how competition is the pathway towards widespread well-being. And that's clearly something we all need to be paying attention to, is the basic economic literacy that we would prefer to see in the United States, and that Radko talks about seems to be much better in other parts of the world where there's been an experience of the opposite. At the same time, I think that just raises new questions for me, because what I'm really interested in beyond that is understanding how the data break down with respect to a skepticism about government can take at least two different forms. One is a skepticism about government intent. In other words, I think that I would wager to guess that a lot of the below 40 crowd, especially in the United States, is very skeptical about government's intent to do good with respect to the poor, improving access to economic prosperity, equality before the law. For example, I think that there is a great deal of cynicism and skepticism, almost to the point where you'd kind of say that's a kind of healthy skepticism, because it's kind of public choice in its orientation to be skeptical, to kind of take the romance out of government. So I think that actually can be a good thing in one respect. But deeper than that, though, is and much more difficult to grasp, much more difficult to teach, is a kind of skepticism about government's capacity to do good if it's well intended. So, for example, the orientation around if we can just get the right people in charge, it's not a matter of can government be effective. It's a matter of getting the right people in charge. And so what happens here in this distinction, if I believe that government could, in fact, be effective in tackling and successfully tackling all the biggest challenges of the world, like unequal access to economic opportunity. If we think that the government can intervene effectively, then our focus then becomes about getting the right people in power. And that's where I think we're breaking down in terms of the United States education about economic realities. It's not that people don't understand incentives. I think it's that people don't understand that basic Hayekian lesson that even if you had well-intended, benevolent people in charge, there are such profound limits on government's ability to actually affect the kind of change that they want to see. And so they don't look for our solutions, private solutions to the vexing problems we face. And that's really the biggest gap where I think economic educators need to focus.
Okay, well, that's very helpful, and I appreciate that perspective, Emily. And I think that at least to one of the questions that has been coming up, and I think that, Carlos, this is a good chance to talk about maybe the next evolution of some of the research that you'd like to pursue, and that's to essentially dig deeper into the ways we can glean insights into the mentality of people in different countries, what messages they respond to that might be useful for our partners who are trying to bring about this greater appreciation for economic freedom, and some of the institutions that are subtle and not obvious in people's lives, but are really the foundations of prosperity. Do you want to talk a little bit about maybe some of the next generation of research that might go deeper into uncovering trends in economic mentality?
Yes. We are now trying to follow something we started some years ago with Pál, trying to understand what are the determinants of economic mentality, and that will be a part of a chapter we'll be writing for the book you are preparing for next year. And the other thing we're going to look at is through analysis of big data. We're doing this now on Latin America, and then we hope this can be repeated for other regions, is try to understand media influencers and how they act on economic terms, and who are the relevant, how do they influence, and what are the main debates, because we believe that hits especially the younger people who are perhaps the greatest users of these media. And it will be good to understand if these influencers about basically dealing with their tribes, or they really get to people to think differently about different topics.
Very good. Now, I also have a question I think that Pál would be in a good position to answer. We had someone ask about why Canada was not included in the World Values Survey or in our index of it. I believe that has to do with the timing of when different countries answer the different waves of the World Values Survey. Can you clarify what countries we might get data in the coming year that might be incorporated into a future version of this?
Yes, I think they are not finished with the last wave of the World Values Survey, so I think that Canada will be included soon. So they, as far as I can judge it, they will be finished by 2021 October or something like that, and there are more countries to be included.
Yeah. So right now, I think that we have I think it's 77. Is that the right number of countries? I think that we have in the database. I think that we hope will increase because there's some regional conglomerates that Carlos was talking about in the video presentation that are pretty thin in terms of the sample, but we're really hopeful this is going to be an instructive, useful tool for further investigation here. And maybe one final question, I'll throw it back to Carlos again, has to do with the country of Chile, because I think that part of what got me interested in this was that Chile has long been near the top of the different indices of economic freedom, such as the one that Fraser Institute publishes, the Economic Freedom of the World report. And then they had the riots last year, and we saw this incredible backlash to a system that we'd sort of looked at as a model of what we should be aspiring to. And I think a lot of the empirical evidence shows that economic freedom has yielded greater growth and more inclusive growth, lower levels of poverty, all the things that we'd expect. And yet it didn't really show up in the data. So it caught a lot of us by surprise, not necessarily some of our Chilean partners like Axel Kaiser, who's now working with our Center for Latin America. But one person that it didn't catch by surprise is also Carlos Newland, which sort of anticipated this from an earlier version of this work. So Carlos, do you want to comment on Chile?
Yes, when we did the first intent of preparing an index, which appeared in the independent review, that was just me alone. And then Pál was working on economic mentality in Eastern Europe, and we were sort of asking the same questions. And then we did this more sophisticated index. He's also an econometrician. And now this present version of the index is more sophisticated, but we have better questions. And from the beginning, Chile ranked very low, and this greatly surprised us. And how could the most prosperous country that now has an income per capita, I'm Argentine, and we considered historically the Chileans as poor people, less developed compared to Argentina. And now they have a greater income per capita than Argentina. They have a low infant mortality, higher expectancy of life. So they've done very well with their economic pro-market reforms. But it seems that these people who had chosen Salvador Allende, a Marxist, as president, had maybe changed a bit their mentality, but a lot of their anti-market mentality was there latent. And when before the revolts, which could considered be anti-free market revolts to a big extent, started, we were telling our Chilean friends and presenting the index in Chile and saying, beware, this is not a stable equilibrium and something may happen. And I remember a dinner with Chileans the week before, and I was telling them something nasty may happen someday in Chile. I never expect it to happen next week. And then the revolts started and the manifestations. And well, since then, And also when I presented to Chile, many Chileans who were in politics and in political analysis and sociology were thinking the same thing. So it's a bit confirmed what the results of this measurement.
Yeah, and I think that points to the potential that we see in this tool. Greatly hopeful that by looking at economic mentality across different populations, we'll be able to anticipate crises, anticipate opportunities that could be instructive for the community of think tanks that Atlas Network works with all over the world. We need to stop the conversation here as we're out of time for the session. But big thank yous to David Seymour, to Radko Nikolic, and Emily Chamble for letting me put you on the spot. And thank you to our audience for your questions and attention. Also, big thanks to my co-authors, Carlos Newland and Pál Czeglédi. Very excited about Atlas Network's participation in this project, and we're going to be publishing the results more formally in 2021. This concludes our 2020 Liberty Forum, but as I said, we're going to be back to see you now in about 5 hours. The 2020 Freedom Dinner gets underway at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and you're not going to want to miss this one. Thank you, everyone, for your collaborations with Atlas Network and for attending our 2020 Liberty Forum.
Kids were laughing.